Okay, good evening, everybody. Tonight is Wednesday night, which means Halacha and Tanya. Amir Hashem, the next 3 Wednesdays, which are the classes until Rosh Hashanah. So next week, Wednesday night, we'll learn the dinim of Rosh Hashanah. The following week, the dinim of Yom Kippur. And the following week, we'll learn the dinim of Sukkot. So today, we're going to continue where we left off last Wednesday, in the dinim of what's called Meicholas Asuras, forbidden foods. The last thing we were discussing was meat and milk. That not only is it forbidden to eat meat and milk, you're not allowed to cook meat and milk, you're not allowed to benefit from meat and milk. Okay, now, I'm going to elaborate a little bit on the dinim of meat and milk because they're very common occurrences that happen in the kitchen. And I don't mean it as final halacha, but just that people should be aware of issues that come up in the kitchen that you need to ask a question about. So number one, you're not allowed to mix meat and milk together. We learned last time, not only that, between meat and milk, you have to wait 6 hours. Between milk and meat, our custom is based on the Zohar to wait an hour. In addition to waiting the 6 hours and the 1 hour, you need to eat something and to rinse your mouth. And also, it cannot be, like we learned last week, it cannot be in the same meal. It has to be that you already made that benching or after bracha. It can be in the same meal. Years ago, in the European homes and in the early American Jewish homes, there was like a color code for meat and milk. It was very interesting. Meat was red and milk was blue. That was the way it was. For whatever reason, the Jews set it up in a way, and this is in the women's kitchen, basically. You have blue is dairy and red is milchik. So they had red tablecloths for meat and blue tablecloths for, and if you had dishes, the fleshik ones had to have a red lining or red trimming around it, and the dairy had to have blue. And if God forbid, I know cases, God forbid that if a person would buy a set of dishes for meat and it was blue, in the grandparents' eyes, the house was completely treif and it wasn't kosher because blue is dairy and red is milchik and that's it. Today, it doesn't work like that, okay? Today, everything goes. But nevertheless, for instance, there's a din in halacha that if you have a friend sitting in a lunchroom, let's say, and you have a meat sandwich and they have a dairy sandwich, everybody brings their own lunches. You have a meat sandwich and your friend has a cheese sandwich. If you're sitting at the same table, you're not allowed to sit together unless if you have something in between you to remind you that you can't mix the two. Because people, you say, oh, you better give me a piece of this, give me a bite, give me that, give me this. So there's a big issue with that. So in Shulchan Aruch it says that when a person knows somebody and they're sitting at the same table and they're having one meat, one milk, so you have to make sure that there's some type of recognition between the two of them, that, they should put something in between them or whatever. Another interesting thing is it's the custom in Jewish homes that you have separate salt shakers for meat and milk. Many homes, they have separate ketchup for meat and milk. They have separate mustard for meat and milk, separate spices for meat and milk. What's the reason for that? It's a very simple thing. Let's say you have a salt shaker, okay, and you're cooking a pot of soup, and steam is coming up from the soup. And you take the salt shaker and you want to put salt into the soup. So you turn it over and you're pouring salt into the soup. Meanwhile, steam from the chicken soup is coming up. And there are holes in the salt shaker. So there is a fear that some taste of meat, some of this smoke that there's from the meat is going up and going into the salt shaker. Therefore, there's a minig, and this is a proper minig, by the way, that you have separate salt and pepper shakers, special spice shakers for meat and milk. And again, sometimes people are cooking spaghetti and meat spaghetti and meat sauce, and they pour ketchup, and again, the steam comes up, goes into the ketchup. Or if you're making macaroni and cheese, again, the steam can go up. So depending what you do in the kitchen, so to speak, how you run it, but there is a concept of having separate salt shakers, pepper shakers, spice shakers, and any of those types of things that you do use directly with meat and milk. Another interesting din, and this could be very practical. If you have challah on your Shabbos table, and it's a fleishik table, right? You're eating on Shabbos, you're eating meat. That bread has to be treated as meat, because Halacha says inevitably somebody with dirty hands from meat or whatever will take a slice of bread. They might touch another slice of bread a little bit at least, and there might be some type of residue on that bread. So therefore, the halacha is, if you have bread open on the table, not in a bag, it's just on a platter, on a bread tray, bread basket, that bread that you ate at the Shabbos meal has to be treated like meat, and you shouldn't be eating it at a dairy meal. Again, for the same thing, because you might come to take that piece of bread that was touched with meat hands and come and eat dairy with it. Another thing, there's so many of these things. For instance, Halacha says you're not allowed to make dairy bread. You're not allowed to bake dairy bread. Why? Because bread is something which is normally eaten with meat and milk. And if you have you made a roll, a dairy roll, yeah, hametzi roll, and there's milk in there, you might, God forbid, come to forget and eat it at a milching table, fleishik table. So Halacha says like this: the only way it's allowed if you bake it in a different shape than normal bread is baked, or you bake a small quantity which will be completely eaten up at that meal. But you can't bake a whole loaf of bread that has milk in it or any other dairy ingredients in it, because then you might come to eat it with. In fact, Halacha says you're not allowed to eat that bread, period. Why? Because there's a fear you might come to eat it with a meat meal. And the same thing, I know that this is possible, but you're not allowed to bake meat bread. Instead of water, you want to use chicken soup. I don't know. So whatever, this doesn't sound too normal. But then again, you wouldn't be allowed to eat it, to have it, because you may come to eat it with milchiks. Now, there's another din like this. If somebody cuts an onion with a fleishik knife, clean meat knife that you cut an onion, even if the knife wasn't used for meat for a long period of time, more than 24 hours, a week old, 2 weeks old, 3 weeks, it doesn't matter. And you take an onion, garlic, lemon, anything sharp, okay, and you cut it with a meat knife, that onion becomes fleishik, it becomes meat. You cannot use it with a milk meal. In other words, you cannot take an onion that was cut with a meat knife, okay, and let's say you use half the onion, you can't take the other half of onion and slice it and put it on your bagel, lox, and cream cheese sandwich, because that onion has a din of meat. Because the sharpness of the onion makes that the taste of meat, which is absorbed within the knife, because it's sharp, it freshens it. And because it freshens it, it has a fresh taste of meat. Now, what's very important, I'm going to explain the din now, and we're going to see how far we get with these din, but it's a very, very practical, important din. You can't, if somebody, let's say, took a meat pot, even if it was clean, and it was used within 24 hours. It was used within the last 24 hours. Okay? So you take a meat pot, spotlessly clean, but it was used for hot meat in the last 24 hours. And you cook cheese in that pot. The cheese is treif, and the pot is treif. The pot needs to be kosher. Why is this? So we discussed this when we were learning the laws of Pesach, that when you cook meat in a pot, okay, when you cook meat in a pot, the taste of the meat becomes absorbed within the walls of the pot. Now you're going to cook milk in that pot, so the taste of the meat that's absorbed within the wall of the pot is going to come out into the cheese. And the taste of the cheese is going to go into the pot. So therefore, what do you have now? You have the food has meat and milk in it, and the pot has meat and milk in it. So therefore, everything's treif. Everything is treif. But if the pot wasn't used for 24 hours for meat, the pot wasn't used for 24 hours, and then you cooked milk or milchix cheese, whatever, in the pot, the food is kosher. Why is the food kosher? Because after 24 hours, our sages said, the taste which is absorbed within the wall of the pot is a blemished taste. It's not meat anymore. It's a blemished meat. Therefore, the taste of meat after 24 hours, if the pot is clean and not used for hot for 24 hours, the taste of meat from inside the pot that comes out into the food is not real meat. So therefore, the food is kosher because there's no meat and milk together. There's only milk. The meat is not really meat. But the pot is not kosher. Why isn't the pot kosher? Because now in the wall of this pot, you have meat and milk. So again, there's an issue. So you have many scenarios, many scenarios. When you cook cheese in a meat pot, you have a scenario that the food is kosher, but the pot is not kosher. Now, another thing that comes up very, very often, somebody just called me today with a question. They had a milchik dish that was eaten hot, and afterwards, they don't know how, but there was a meat knife on top of it, and on top of the plate. They don't know who, what, when, where. They didn't know what it was. This happens very often. Sometimes you're washing, especially if you're housekeepers, as I said many times, the two big problem people in the kitchen is the men and the housekeepers. I don't know which one's worse. Either the men are worse or the housekeepers are worse in trafing up a kitchen. Okay? By the way, I just want to say another thing which is taught in a lot of classes, and people should be aware of it, that the old European righteous women used to say that a kitchen that's not clean, you can assume is not kosher. That's what they used to say. Not halachically, but factually they say, if a kitchen is not organized, and everything gets mixed up and everything's dirty and clean. And so then you have a lot of issues with kashrus. If it's good, it's not good. Many times you get a question. The housekeeper was washing the cutlery, and then in the cutlery, she was washing the meat cutlery, and in the meat cutlery that she's washing, there was a milchig spoon, milchig fork. So what's the story? Is it kosher or is not kosher? So the first question, and I'm not paskening, I'm just saying people should be aware of what the issue is. Number one, you have to understand the first issue that the Rav is going to ask, was the water very hot when they washed the cutlery? Meaning, put it into practical language, did they use gloves or did they wash with their hands? If they wash with their hands without using gloves, the assumption is the water couldn't be so hot. Because if the water was so hot, they couldn't keep their hand in the water. And therefore, if they used their hands versus gloves, you can assume that the water was not that hot, and therefore the meat and the milk didn't go into each other because it can only go in with very hot water. So therefore, you can assume it's kosher. But a shaila needs to be asked. Many times you have shailas that come up, and this happens very often, by the way. Kids come into the kitchen and they'll heat up a pizza in a fleshik microwave oven. It happens very often. Kids will heat up a pizza in a fleshik oven, or they heat up some fleshiks in a milchik microwave. It's a shaila. What's the din? You have cases that by mistake somebody cooked milk in a meat oven. A lot of times it happens by mistake. You cook meat in a milk oven, milk in a meat oven. It happens. You have to know what the shaila is. So number one, it definitely helps if the oven is clean, because then halachically it's much easier. If the oven is dirty with meat residue or milk residue, then you have big problems about the kashrus of that food and the oven. So these are all practical things that come up. I'll tell you where there's a bigger problem. If they use a dishwasher and you're washing meat, dishes, and cutlery in a meat dishwasher, and then you open up the dishwasher and you're taking out the cutlery and you see there's a dairy spoon, a fork, or knife in there. It happens very often, especially when the housekeepers are doing it. There is a milk spoon in a dishwasher. Now, the problem with the dishwasher is the water gets very hot. So now the question is, there's a mixture of meat and milk, and you don't know what's what, and it's a big problem. It's a big problem. But these shilas have to be asked. So I'm just throwing out cases, scenarios that people should know. Issues come up in the kitchen when everybody comes into the kitchen, kids, housekeepers, husbands, men come into the kitchen. There's always issues with this. Another thing which is very important, and somebody just called me last week with this question. They have similar knives, okay? Exactly the same knives for milchiks and fleshings. Okay? She knows she has, let's say, one knife milchik, one knife fleshing, exactly the same. They're not even marked. But she says they always kept on separate sides of the kitchen. Okay? They call me up that they found both two knives in the fleshing side. Now, how did that milchik knife get into the fleshing side? So first of all, the first thing which is wrong, you don't have similar things to meat and milk. You can't have the same pattern cutlery for meat and milk. Because of course inevitably they're going to get mixed up and you won't even know what's milchiks and what's fleshiks. So if there's a separate pattern, separate design for meat and milk and cutlery and dishes and all that, so then it's much easier to know what's what. But if you're going to have the same cutlery for milchiks and fleishiks and the same knives for milchiks and fleishiks, that's a very big problem. In fact, in Shulchan Aruch it says that it's proper to mark a knife, which they used in those days. They didn't have a variety of knives; they had one type of a knife. So it says you should mark the dairy knife, make a mark on it that you should know it's dairy or meat if you want. But the knife, you need to keep a separation between meat and milk, that you shouldn't come to mix them up, God forbid. Another interesting thing is that when it comes to meat and milk, I wanted to say another thing. Oh, there's a minig, and this also you have very often. People have, let's say, a meat oven, and they want to make milchiks in the oven. Can they kosher the oven from meat to milk or from milk to meat? So generally speaking, there's a minig, even though the Alter Rebbe does not bring it down, but this is the minig nevertheless in the world, that you don't kasher, it's a Magen Avram, they're right, you don't kasher from milchiks to fleishiks. You don't, that's it. Milchik stays milchik, fleishik stays fleishik, and you don't kasher between the two. But many poskim hold, and that's the way we hold basically, that's only if you're going to kasher with hot water. It's called hagala, purging. When you do hot water kashering, you don't kasher from milchiks to fleishiks, or fleishiks to milchiks. But if you're doing it with libun, meaning direct fire, whether it's libun kal, libun gum, or whatever, then if it's done on not a regular basis, it's not done on a regular basis, but you do it every so often, you're allowed to kasher from milchiks to fleishiks and fleishiks to milchiks. So for instance, if somebody for Shavuos wants to make cheesecake and they only have a fleishika oven, so halachically they can kasher the oven, make milchiks in it, and then kasher the oven and make it back fleishiks again. Why? Because it's not with hagala, it's not with the hot water process, it's with libun, so to speak, direct fire, and then the dark tshuva and a lot of other poskim are lenient about all that. Now, another interesting shaila that comes up.
Direct fire, is that a very hot oven? Can that be considered a libun?
Even if it's not self-cleaning, you can kasher from milchiks to fleishiks. What happens if somebody, here's another interesting shaila. If somebody cuts an onion with a meat knife, okay? So we learned the onion is fleishik. The question, does that make me, if I eat the onion, am I fleishik for 6 hours? Am I fleishik for 6 hours? Because the oven now, the onion, because it's sharp, has a taste of meat in it. The poskim right, I can't say nobody is mach, but the halacha, the halacha is you can't eat it together with cheese. Like I said, you can't put it on your lox and cream cheese sandwich, but you don't have to wait 6 hours. Right after you finish eating the onion, then you're able to right away eat the milchiks or fleishiks, whichever way you did it. But you have to be very careful with the milchiks and the fleishiks. They have to be kept separate. And now, for instance, there's a shaila in halacha. Are you allowed to use the same knife sharpener, the board, the stone or so, that you sharpen knives with? Are you allowed to use the same knife sharpener for meat and milk knives? So some people want to say you have to be macham, but the halacha is that you're allowed to use the same sharpener for meat and milk. Same knife sharpening. Another interesting thing somebody just asked me the other day, they say they heard a concept of sticking a knife in the ground 10 times. or or what they heard is you take a knife that became treif and you bury it in the ground for a day or two and then it's kosher. I'll never forget. I moved into my second apartment here in LA when I moved into the Beverly Hills area, and there was a dishwasher there, and the landlady was Jewish, not too religious, but she said to me, I thought I can't use the dishwasher because I don't want to kosher it. She says, "Why can't you kosher? Just put some salt on it." She thought you kosher chicken with salt. She thought that's the way you kosher things, by putting some salt on it. So the din is like this. When do you have to stick the knife in the ground 10 times? It's not burying the knife in the ground. It's sticking the knife 10 times into hard ground. What's that scenario? That scenario is rare, but not so rare. If I have a block of cheese, not cottage cheese, cream cheese, that's soft. I have a block of hard cheese, and I take a fleshik knife that's clean, and I cut the cheese with that meat knife. The din is that knife became milchik a little bit. How did it become milchik? It's all cold. So in halacha, this was called duchka de sakina. Duchka de sakina means the pressure of the knife. When I cut, I'm not smearing peanut butter on a piece of bread. I'm forcibly cutting, pushing the knife into the cheese. So halacha says because of the pressure of the knife, some cheese will become absorbed within the knife. How do you undo that? Like we learned by kashering, you undo it the way it went in. So what do? You take that knife that was cut cold cheese with a cold fleshik knife, and you stick it in hard ground 10 times. That pressure of pushing it into the ground in the hard, not soft mud, it has to be hard dirt, 10 times, that removes the dairy taste that went in by pushing the knife the meat knife into the cheese. Okay, that's it for this. We're going to go to Tanya. Mitzvah Shem. Next week we will learn the laws of Rosh Hashanah. But let's go now to Tanya.